His Excellency, Papa Airlangga Hartarto, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, I would like to welcome all of you to this distinguished public lecture. It is an honor for us to welcome the Coordinating Minister of Indonesia for Economic Affairs, as well as General Chairman of Indonesia's Golkar Party, His Excellency Papa Airlangga Hartarto. Papa Airlangga will be speaking on the topic Indonesia, Singapore, ASEAN, and the new Asian landscape. As all of you have read in the newspaper, Indonesia will assume the chairmanship of ASEAN in 2023. This is a special moment for Indonesia as its chairmanship coincides with ASEAN's renewed vigor to be a positive factor for regional development, lasting peace, and continued prosperity. As chair of ASEAN, Indonesia is expected to come up with new initiatives to address many outstanding issues affecting our region, as well as the wider world beyond Southeast Asia. These range from the contestation between the world's number one and number two economic power to the current crisis in Myanmar, as well as how do we successfully navigate these times out of the COVID-19 pandemic towards economic recovery. All of us are confronted now with issues such as energy and food security, as well as the implications of the very serious climate change. Everywhere we see either floods or drought. And in Singapore, Papa, we will see more and more activities on our coastal area as our relevant authority try to raise our land next to the sea coast. So, we are going to be in a very busy period as we look at how ASEAN countries, particularly with Indonesian leadership, addresses some of these very overwhelming challenges. At the same time today, we are all familiar with the crisis which led to the war in Ukraine. Looking forward, it is particularly important for Singapore and Indonesia to work together to find some good and lasting solution to these global and regional issues. This distinguished public lecture will give us some idea of how Indonesia sees some of these challenges and how Singapore can possibly fit in with Indonesia's effort to accomplish some of the necessary solutions and management going forward. All of you are aware with the background of Papa Airlangga Hartarto. His well-known public service and career has already been given in the information inviting all of you to this public lecture. But let me just take a few minutes to highlight one or two things. Minister Airlangga Hartarto is Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs in the Republic of Indonesia. This means he is quite a superman because Indonesia is a very big economy. Yeah, it is the largest economy in ASEAN at least. Yeah, and on top of that, economic today isn't just about trade and investment. There are many other issues. So you will hear what Hartarto will tell us afterward about his work and his assessment going forward, and then from there you can see the range of issues that he had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. And as chairman of Golkar Party since 2017, there is another set of hard work that he has to manage every day. Yeah. Hopefully we can also get some insight into his work as the Golkar Party chairman as he delivers our lecture. So I think we should now listen to our guest, Bapak Airlangga Hartarto, and after that maybe we can make some questions or pose some comments for him to respond to us. So without further ado, may I invite His Excellency Minister Airlangga Hartarto to deliver his lecture today. Bapak, please.
Thank you. Ambassador Ong Keng Yew, Excellencies, Ambassadors, Ambassadors Tommy Suryo Pratomo, and then good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And in this room, I also bring my delegations, that is the chief editor of 7 prominent media in Indonesia. It is a great pleasure for me to speak here at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Over the years, RSIS has emerged as respected thought leader on Asia, especially on defense and security. And I'm also happy to see many friends and colleagues here. It is not an overstatement to say that recent times have been produced profound challenge to the social fabrics of our societies, economic fundamentals, geopolitics, Asia, and the world. Today, I would like to start my public lecture by sharing some personal reflection on what we have gone through in Indonesia in recent years, on how this experience shaped my view on the challenge from global political and economic uncertainties and opportunities for the ASEAN, on the second and last part of the lecture. On Indonesian economy, Indonesia this year celebrated Hari Raya Idul Fitri, our Independent Day, and participated in other public events in person among friends and family for the first time since 2019. Needless to say, the COVID-19 profoundly changed our way of life. In early March 2020, we had our first 2 cases of COVID-19 infections. Immediately, we established the COVID-19 task force. Like in many other countries, we imposed people mobility restriction, measure to try to contain the spread of COVID-19. The public health measure caused unprecedented supply shock, including closure of shopping centers, factories, and many publics as well as religion places, such as churches or mosques. The industry is affected and causing unemployment rate to climb and poverty rate to jump. Almost instantly, the fallen purchasing power led the sharp decline in domestic demand. The COVID-19 pandemic hit us with a little to no roadmap guidance to prepare our policy actions. The past economic and financial crisis, however, taught us that in difficult circumstances, our policy approach has to be flexible, with our policy instrument have to be ready with maximum capacity. Within few weeks following the detection of the COVID-19 case in the country, a critical government decree number 1 of 2020 was introduced in March 31 to give the government a much greater maneuvering policy to navigate the health and economic challenge. The new decree, including the relaxation of the strict financial or fiscal rule introduced in 2003, which limit the annual budget deficit to be not more than 3% of the normal GDP. Moreover, with little time waste, we integrated our health and economic policy under one coordination that we call the PCPAN, Committee of COVID-19 Handling and Economic Recovery, officially established in July 2020, which the early preparation has started in April 2020. The President gave me the mandate to lead the PCPAN committee, and instantly my portfolio as Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs expand from initially responsibility of coordinating 9 economic ministers to coordinate very much all cabinet ministry, the police, the military, and the local government. Under the committee, we design and promptly implement what we call the brake and gas policy framework to balance the life and livelihood. There are 3 blocks of brake and gas strategy. The brake strategy, or the pedal brake, is to set a COVID-19 policy to safeguard life. The ultimate aim is to contain the spread of COVID-19. The overall strategy is a mix of wide and massive public testing and tracing, genomic surveillance to contain the spread of COVID-19, enhancing therapeutic capacity by including conversion 30 to 40% of hospital bed allocation for COVID-19 patients, and deployment additional healthcare staff and centralization of isolation. Vaccination targeted to 270 million Indonesian. Health protocol in particular for public space and transportation. To ensure the effectiveness of the brake strategy, we also executed a number of innovation. The centralized micro-scale activity and mobility restriction, what we call the PPKM, that is warranted a solid collaboration between central, local government across 34 provinces and 500 cities in the countries. The Peduli Lindungi application for tracing and vaccination, similar to Trace Together in Singapore, was quickly designed, tested, and implemented to trace the spread of infection in timely manner and to organize the massive vaccination program across the Indonesian archipelago over 70,500 islands. Telemedicine is established to provide quick medical response, medical advices, and medicine distribution, and to lessen the burden of health facilities. On the other hand, on the pedal acceleration, what we call gas strategy, is designed to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on various sectors of the economy and at the same time to anchor the economic growth. The relaxation of the fiscal policy rule as stipulated in government regulation facilitate a significantly much larger fiscal financing to mitigate the adverse impact of the pandemic and to safeguard the livelihood. And all the same time to sustain the productive activity for safeguarding economic growth and transformation of the economy. And the third is commitment to push the structural reform, and transformation is also important as a part of the gas or acceleration pedal strategy. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 exposed us to global pandemic crisis, which none of us had lived through this type of massive scale of health financial crisis before. We united and acted quickly. I'm proud and humbled to report that Indonesia has been recognized as among the top 5 nations in the world with a highest rate of vaccination. We have vaccinated over 430 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to our population. Allow me to say a few words on the structural reforms, the third pillars of our gas and brake strategy framework. I'm among the strong believers that crisis period is the best opportunity to structurally reform the domestic economy. From the start of my current post, we embarked in one of the most ambitious and comprehensive economic reform, initially known as the Omnibus Law, and eventually named the Job Creation Law. During the same year that we scrambled to deal with the health crisis, we flew through and passed the job creation in November 2020. Unlike the past, where we carried out piecemeal reform, this time we designed the Omnibus Law to push for simultaneously and integrated reform affecting over 70 laws across 11 economic clusters, addressing costly labor regulation of hiring and firing workers, complicated land permits, and complex investment approval process are among the targets of job creation law. One of the immediate tangible outcomes of job creation law is establishment of the Indonesia Investment Authority, or INA, the country sovereign wealth fund that has now involved in several joint domestic investment projects with major international partners, including major sovereign wealth fund and institutional investor from this region and the world. Let me also add here that we are embarking into the transition to the new economy of digital and green. The G20 Indonesia Presidency 2022 placed major agenda, the global public health system, economic transformations and digitalization, the green energy transition, as well as we discuss about food security. As a nation, we are committed to national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement to cut our emission by 29% very last at 2030, and the net zero carbon emission by 2060 or earlier. We adopted two approaches to meet the target, first through energy diversification measures, and second through energy conservation measures. Implementation of the policies on the minimum energy performance and the electric vehicle program are two examples of ongoing policy initiative under the energy conservation measures. As for energy diversification measure, we embarked in a number of ambitious projects, like early retirement of coal power plant, around 9.1 gigawatt by 2027. Biofuel utilization, we are one of the B30, the largest biofuel in the world at the moment. Renewable energy plants such as solar and hydropower. New energy alternatives such as nuclear plant to be the alternate provider of baseload electricity. The COVID-19 pandemic also intensified digital penetration in our economy. Close to 100% of our traders are now involved in e-commerce, and close to 60% of them have settled payment digitally. In 2010, it's about 10% Indonesia population between 16 to 17 people have access of internet. By 2020, the numbers close to 54%. Undoubtedly, our economic landscape has changed due to our commitment to digitalization and climate change. We are aware that the transition will be full potential shocks and headwinds. Issue of data safety, privacy, sovereignty, and data protection have been the center of our effort to strengthen the domestic data center capacity. The lack of clarity on the international standard and definition of green financial assets such as green bond and green equity will expose the emerging market and developing countries to high cost of financing. As a member of G20, the interests of the emerging markets are among the priorities of the G20 presidency. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Let me now move to the second part of my lecture, in which I'm going to share my view on a number of key issues. It is undeniable that the world has entered a new era, for Asia especially. The global environment has become fraught with increasing geopolitical risks. The turning point is when 150,000 Russian troops poured across the border into Ukraine on 20 February 2022. Here we see a combination of short-term as well as the long-term challenges. Let me start first with the short-term headwinds. In the coming years, a common concern among economy will be the rampant increase in prices. Global supply chains were hit badly during COVID-19 pandemic as factory shutdown, employee absences, and travel restriction severely impeded production capacity worldwide. While this might not have been as much of an issue during pandemic, as demand also show a similar drop-off, it is a major challenge now as countries gradually emerge from their respective virus lockdown. Demand is ramping up at pace which supply is unable to keep, resulting in inflationary pressure across many goods and services. The problem of high inflation is exacerbated by the outbreak of geopolitical conflict such as the Russia-Ukraine war, which has caused a surge in price of important food and energy commodities. Ukraine is a major producer of grain, such as corn and wheat. They produce almost 70 million, while numerous countries rely on Russia exports of oil and gas to meet their energy demand. Brent crude price approached $130 per barrel in March 2022, the highest they have been since 2008. Similarly, the price of grain have jumped to their highest level in over a decade amid the shortage of grain export from Ukraine. Thanks God, now they are moving again. That's because of the President Joko Widodo visit to Ukraine as well as to Moscow, where President Joko Widodo asked that the Russia to open and secure the Odessa vessel trip to Turkey. And it was agreed by the two leaders as well as the UN Secretary General. While the inflation picture has not been pretty for the most part of the year, there is hope for an easing of food price as Russia, when the UN Turkey opened the blockade of the shipping. Oil prices have also down and somewhat, although they remain volatile and elevated well above the pre-pandemic level. ASEAN should brace itself for political resurgence of oil price. And lastly, we heard that OPEC still try to limit the expansion of their volume. So the rise in food price in particular has triggered concern over food security. And we in ASEAN will definitely bear the brunt of any inflation in food price, with more than 660 million mouths to feed in Southeast Asia. To respond to global crisis, food, energy, as well as financial crisis, the Secretary General of the United Nations has asked the President Joko Widodo, along with 5 other heads of the state for government, to form a champions group of global crisis and response group. While consumer price inflation remains a salient issue, a greater concern to the global economy is slowdown in China. As the world's second largest economy and a giant trade in manufacturing, China's slump will certainly drag down the growth in other parts of the world. China is still ASEAN's largest trading partner, a status that it has held since 2009. The trade volume of goods between China and ASEAN is around 878.2 billion in 2021, in almost quadruples in 20 when the figure is just around 235 billion. With the widespread pessimism among the Chinese consumer, we should expect to suffer drop-off in their purchases of ASEAN-made goods. And as manufacturing and construction activities in slow, we should also prepare for a decline in export volume of energy commodities like coal and gas to China. I would like to move from looking at short-term challenges to address some challenges that are likely to be longer lasting. The global economy has experienced some important structural shifts, which ASEAN and Indonesia must understand well and respond to it. First, the kind of globalization that powered several decades of supercharged growth in trade and foreign investment is now giving way to something less dramatic. We are not seeing the end of the globalization or deglobalization as some would say, but we are likely to see much lower pace of globalization, rising protectionism, politically driven supply chain, reconfiguration including the reshoring production back to developed nations, and other form of inward-looking policy that will hold back the growth of world trade. Second, the impact of climate change is becoming painfully evident and a more alarming speed than any of us can imagine. The economic consequences of higher temperatures, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather patterns will be severely damaging. The cost of adapting to or mitigating climate change will be substantial, as well as will require all of us to find ways to finance these unavoidable efforts. The process of decarbonization will force a restructuring of global production with many more losers than winners initially. The third, we are on the cusp of extraordinary technology challenge. This is not just the area of information technology, such as artificial intelligence, robotic, machine learning, and so on, all of which are quite dramatic in their impact. But we are also seeing transformational developments across many other sectors. In renewable energy, solar and wind power have become economically viable, are taking off, but that is just the beginning. There will be other renewable energy that will emerge, such as hydrogen. Then you have a dramatic development in the biomedical science. Advances in genomic will be able to host new therapies and medication, while improved biomedical equipment that will revolutionize the treatment and surgeries. Similarly, we are seeing advances in material science, and the list goes on. The key thing is advance in some sectors will enable faster improvement in other areas, which then produce a powerful dynamic of rapidly accelerating change everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that technology can be exciting and enhance our living standard, but we also know that the new technology can often cause dislocation as well. Whole sectors of economic activity could find themselves irrelevant and shrink, with immense consequences for jobs and livelihood. Some countries could see their area of competitive advantage shrinking. I could go on, but the main point I want to make is clear. The coming decades will be a period of tumult and turbulence in the global economy. There will be shifts that will be hard to predict. There will be great uncertainty for policymakers and for business leaders. And there will be immense pressure from various segments of society for protection and assistance to weather these storms. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the final part of my talk is into the challenge that ASEAN faces. On internal economic challenge, ASEAN member countries must be bold in implementing domestic reform to achieve inclusive growth. Several countries have been able to reach impressive GDP growth figures in the past 2 decades, but this comes at the cost of rising income inequality within their societies. The outbreak of COVID-19 has aggravated inequality within ASEAN. According to a report by the ASEAN Development Bank released in March this year, 4.7 million people in Southeast Asia were plunged to extreme poverty in 2021. As a result of pandemic, based on their IDB definition of extreme poverty, these people are surviving less than $1.50 in a day. Furthermore, the pandemic has led to loss over 9.3 million jobs in Southeast Asia, compared with baseline with no COVID scenario. With job creation stunted, income fall further, and those who are already poor are hit the hardest. A 2020 survey conducted in developing ASEAN countries by ADB institution found that 50% of households only had sufficient financial resources to cover their expense for 1 month. These findings show ASEAN has much work to do to ensure that as we emerge from pandemic, everyone can benefit equally from the rebound in economic growth. There is no point in attaining stellar GDP figures if growth is not inclusive and the fruits of prosperity are not enjoyed by the man on the street. The pandemic offers a chance for ASEAN countries to reset and rethink domestic reform that can help to address income inequality. Education and labor policies can be implemented to help lower wages workers to upskill themselves so that they can find jobs in high-value industry that have expanded rapidly with technological growth. Separately, the World Economic Forum recommends countries to overhaul their financial services with the aim of improving the credit access for the poor. Another shortcoming that we must address through reform is the lack of high-quality infrastructure in some of ASEAN countries. Infrastructure constraints have plowed the economy development potential in Asia for too long. In recent years, infrastructure development in Asia was hit hard by the pandemic. Projects were delayed due to the insufficient labor and government financing, which was focused on fiscal measures to stabilize economic demand. There is much room for an increase in infrastructure investment. The ADB estimated that Southeast Asia alone struggled with annual infrastructure financing gap of 3.8 to 4.1% of its GDP, equivalent around 114 to 127 billion US dollar in a year. With the worst effect the pandemic, now dissipating infrastructure development must return to the forefront of government priority with important implications for their economy. Indonesia has set a good example for other ASEAN countries to follow by boosting infrastructure development through private-public partnership. For a long time, Indonesia suffered from major connectivity problem, but President Joko Widodo has pushed aggressively for the use of private-public partnership to accelerate infrastructure projects. Among the biggest project is 33 billion Trans-Sumatra toll road connecting province in Sumatra using a combination of public-private partnership. ASEAN has the opportunity to turn challenge into the strength. Amid intensifying big power contestation in the region and global geopolitical tension, it is time like this when the importance of economic integration ASEAN come to force. When external demand factors cannot be relied upon to drive growth in our economy, we must instead turn inward and look for ways for further enhance existing trade within the bloc. Doing so would allow us to build more resilient ASEAN economy that is capable of withstanding the global economic headwinds. ASEAN has made notable progress toward achieving enhancing regional economic integration, including initiatives like ASEAN Economic Communities Blueprint. The AAC Blueprint 2025 was built on 5 interrelated pillars. One, a highly integrated and cohesive economy. Second, a competitive and innovative and dynamic ASEAN. The third is enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation. And the fourth is resilient, inclusive, people-oriented and people-centered ASEAN. And the fifth is a global ASEAN. We are now more than halfway through the 10 years implementation plan for Blueprint 2025. Among other things, plan has been successful in eliminating tariff and facilitating trade within an ASEAN, while also streamlining capital market regulation to liberalize investment in the region. We should be proud of this achievement and build upon them to complete the rest of Blueprint 2025 in the next 3 years. Outside of the AEC, we can also look forward to a wider regional integration with parties outside of ASEAN, or ASEAN plus 5, which is free trade agreement such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which the RCEP was first introduced in 2011 when Indonesia chaired ASEAN. The attractiveness of such agreement is now higher than ever, as global supply chain seeks to become more durable following the pandemic and start to organize at regional or local level. The RCEP come into force in the beginning of this year and will eventually eliminate more than 90% of goods traded between signatory countries. ASEAN and the wider Asia-Pacific region will definitely benefit from having such liberal trade. In fact, RCEP members are projected to gain 174 billion in real income by 2030 through the partnership, based on estimated by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as I come to the end of my speech, I would like to express my confidence that ASEAN will continue to grow from strength to strength in the years ahead. We have an abundant natural and human resource to tap on, and the excess of pent-up saving that accumulated over the past few COVID hit years, they are ready to unleash as ASEAN and other Asia economic begin to open after the pandemic. But in order to fully maximize this huge growth potential, I would like to stress that ASEAN must stay united. In face of internal and external pressures, we must diligently undertake the required reform to remove all obstacles in the way of our region growth. Thank you for your kind attention.